My name is Lawrence Klerkx, or Laurens Klerkx in Dutch. I apologize for the Dunglish beforehand, but maybe that's good for the non-native speakers to understand me. I'm an associate professor at the Knowledge, Technology and Innovation Group. Jaime was very kind to scale me up to professor in the program. I'm very grateful for that. Please tell my boss. Hopefully he will take your advice. My group does research on innovation processes, the role of research and innovation, the role of advisory services in innovation. We look at all kinds of topics, animal production, biotechnology. We work both in Europe and in developing countries. My own interests are very much on the organization of innovation, how to make people collaborate for innovation because different parties are involved. And Jaime asked me to talk a little bit about concepts related to scaling. And I think that my presentation connects very nicely to the previous presentation. Some of the tensions, the concerns raised there, you can see them in the models that have been developed to understand this process of innovation development and scaling of innovation or scaling of new developments. So I took this from the program, some of the challenges for alternative agri-food networks, growing in scale by providing the right quantity at the right time, at the right place, also a broader range of products, and also improving accessibility and convenience. So basically it's about having this small group maybe of producers in a very particular location that they spread out and have their produce in more places. And maybe there's also an inherent tension in that, as we heard in the previous presentation. But these are some of the scaling challenges Jaime provided. And while these relate, in my view, both to what people have been calling scaling up and scaling out, although the terminology is not very clear. People sometimes also use scaling up to talk about scaling out. And then if you take really the definitions very strictly, then scaling out would be more about extending the geographical reach, more people reached. For example, we work a lot with farmers and adoption of new technologies, new practices, integrated pest managers, for example. And then if we talk about scaling out, then it is about, is it 10, 50, 100,000, 50,000 farmers who have taken up this technology, then it's scaled out. When we talk about scaling up, then it's much more about embedding an approach in institutional structures. And so if you take the example of integrated pest management, then it would also be about is integrated pest management becoming a part of policy? Are the rules and regulations also geared towards promoting these types of practices so that farmers will be more inclined to adopt these practices because it becomes very logical for them to do so. Otherwise, if they don't comply, they would get a fine. And so there's a slight difference in scaling out and scaling up, but I will now use the term scaling up to talk about both. And for this presentation, I'm going to consider alternative agricultural food networks as what you could call niche practices. But I also put in between brackets the word mature, because one could say that the niche has grown over time. It has its origin in the 80s already, or maybe even earlier, and we now really see it already established. It's not like that novel anymore, it's not underground anymore, but still compared to the conventional system, it's something different, it's not mainstream. And this whole idea then of scaling up would be about how to foster, nurture these niches so that they become stronger and really can become a viable alternative or really can become part of the new mainstream. And that would be the idea of scaling up AAFN. So this is my principal conceptual contribution. Well, actually it's not mine, I didn't invent it, but it's widely used within agri-food studies and also in other fields of study to understand transitions, or what's also some people call system innovation. So really radically changing various aspects of systems to arrive to a new society. For example, we are now in the transition from an exploitative society based on fossil fuels, and we hope to achieve a circular economy, a bio-based economy in which there's no waste anymore, and in which we don't use fossil fuels anymore. That's a transition we are in the midst, but obviously we are not yet there. So also the time horizons of these transitions, they can be up to 50 years or maybe even longer. So I'll explain a little bit the model here. I hope you can read it. Because it's not that big, I apologize for that. But the idea is that the incumbent, the dominant systems, they are so-called socio-technical regimes. They're kind of dynamically stable systems which remain the same over time. Think, for example, about the fossil fuel system. We've been having this already for a long time, over 100 years. If you think, for example, about mobilities, about cars, they still have a similar combustion engine. The car still has a similar design. Of course, incremental improvements have been made, but we still have basically the same car. And connected to that car, there's a whole system which assures that we have cheap fuel, we have technology developed for that, we have a whole war apparatus which secures our access to oil. We have all kinds of lobby groups to make sure that the oil companies can continue doing that. We have a whole infrastructure of roads, gas stations, and that is all the socio-technical regime. And of course, we can have shocks. For example, the Al Gore movie, you could call it a shock, at least an awareness shock. And then some of the oil companies start talking about, oh yes, we should do things differently, but that fades away once the shock is over. Or when we have a war there, then the oil prices go up, everybody goes into alternative fuels for a while, and then when the oil prices go down again, then attention also fades away. So these systems are very persistent. But these systems, they're challenged by niches, people who want to do things differently. If you think about mobility, there are all kinds of alternatives now. Solar cells, hydrogen energy, bioenergy. Lots of people are developing novelties in these niches to change this socio-technical regime, but obviously there's lots to change, so that it's not easy. And this is then influenced by landscape developments, and landscape developments are, for example, climate change, also wars, that kind of stuff, which really open up windows of opportunities for these niche people and to have a better possibility to change the regime, because there's just a good environment for that. And so you could see these alternative agricultural food networks or agri-food networks as niches, who wants to change the incumbent system of long supply chains, producers who receive a very small amount of what is finally made out of food products, etc. Supermarkets who steer it. This has grown over time, and it's very robust. You can't change it that easily. And I think the metaphor is really nice. Regime change, it really takes a lot of work, and often also it takes a lot of underground preparatory work before you can have the revolution. Think, for example, of the Arab Spring. That didn't happen overnight, but a window of opportunity emerged when there were high food prices, a lot of dissatisfaction, helped by social media, that kind of accelerated it and caused what people from complexity science would call a tipping point. But it only worked in some countries. In other countries, it has gone back to the status quo with other people, but essentially the same regimes. I think, for example, about Egypt, where you have a similar situation as with Mubarak. But with another guy. So here's some examples of regimes versus niches. Well, I already talked about this. This would be the regime. This would be one of the niches. Now we still have very nice nurses, but maybe in 40 years we'll have a nice robot taking care of us. The robotization is also one of these possible transitions we are facing. And here, bringing it down to agriculture, Monsanto, biotech, they're a very dominant player providing seed packages, etc. They're also seen as quite evil by some of the people within these circles. So you could call this the regime and this the niche, although this is also already a very mature niche. And you could even say that it, to some extent, has already merged with the regime, or the regime has taken up aspects from the niche to change itself from within. So if you also bring it back to this model with all the arrows and the dots, you can see different phases in these transitions, and this looks a little bit like an adoption curve for those in innovation studies, but it's not exactly the same. And basically, this model says, well, you have a long period of pre-development, pioneers working on stuff, creating new arrangements, developing technologies, creating networks, doing advocacy, and then at some stage they grow in force, they grow in terms of the possibilities they have to really scale up their efforts, and then you go into a takeoff breakthrough phase, and that leads to a stabilization, and then the alternative system turns into kind of the new dominant system. And this is, of course, also one of the fears that alternative system is not alternative anymore, but can also be a possibility if it brings better incomes for farmers, for example. You could say, I think, that with this alternative food movement, we might be somewhere here. I think we are way beyond the pre-development phase, but it's really going towards a breakthrough and becoming more dominant. So, if you look at this multi-level perspective of transitions, of course it's a very nice model to explain very big societal developments, but people are criticizing it because it's also a very coarse model. It doesn't really explain the practices, and it really looks at whole sectors, and it's not really useful to help people in doing the actual scaling up. It explains the developments, explains regime change, but not really, okay, how have people then brought about that regime change? So people who work with this multi-level model, they have said, okay, we should look much more at agency, the stuff people do to bring about change. And there people have said we should look at practices, which practices should change at different levels to enable this transition. And that is then both at the niche and at the regime level. So, very nicely in line with this workshop, which is about ICT, and this is coincidence, it's not on purpose. We have been working on this idea of scaling as a collection of wares. And this is led by a colleague of mine called Klerkx. We are in a big program on agricultural intensification in the human tropics, and there we have a group which is called Responsible Scaling. There we have been working with on these teams. And he basically further developed ideas on innovation as a combination of hardware, software, and orgware. That is an expression which was coined by a guy called Rich Smits in 2002, and that was mainly to indicate innovation is more than technology. Hardware, it's also lots of knowledge involved from different people. Software, and it's also about institutional change. Changing the way of working, changing the rules of the game, the orgware. So building on that initial one, this guy, Seert, my colleague with the team, has invented much more wares, which explain the different elements needed in the scaling process. What do you need to work on? That is what this tries to explain. So there are roughly 3 clusters of categories of wares, and an integrated one. And one is about interactions and transactions. If you want to scale up new practices, you have to change often the interactions and the way you do transactions. For example, how to access supermarkets, that requires new business models. But it's also about standards, for example, hygiene standards. Lots of alternative food networks have been hindered initially because standards were very rigid. It did not allow, for example, for typical cheeses because it did not comply with the letter of the law, or how, as we say in English. So this consists of ruleware, so institutions, formal, but also informal, symbolic capital. What is food? What should agriculture look like? For example, if the paradigm is really this should be small alternative food networks, how can you then scale? Orgware, this is about the setups, the business models, the value chain configurations. It's also about how to finance this, so that also farmers are not exploited anymore. And also about how to invest in scaling this up, so it's about the finware, the financial assets. And it's also about the social resources and abilities, which is also about how to learn as a network, how to develop a vision where to go to. So you have software, theories, ideas, technologies, the pathways you see for your alternative food network, and also the actware. This is can people really engage in these types of processes in terms of their mental ability, their cognitive skills, but also their health. Do they have time to invest in that? So this is another type of wares. Of course, then you also have the natural and physical resources, the netware and the hardware. Well, maybe in alternative food networks this is not such a big issue, but for example, if you want to upgrade small producers in Africa, this is a big issue, how to use natural resources differently, how to use technologies, for example. And then one thing, it's also about sense and meaning making, it's the soulware, it's about the identity of these networks. It's very important, what moves people in these types of networks. So these are all elements which play a role in scaling up, and you should work with them. And so all these different wares that play a role in practices, so if you want to change practices, you have to deal with them. So here practices are connected human activities, it's a combination of the hardware, netware, and actware within a particular context, maybe a regime context. It's inspired by software, guided by pathware, it's the direction people have, their beliefs, their learnings. It's arranged through orgware and ruleware, it's motivated by the hardware. For the English speaker, that's very difficult to make a distinction. And which are performed towards a common purpose, and they're evaluated in relation to internal and external normativity. And so when scaling up takes place, there's always that people in the niche are looking, okay, how does this correlate to what we want, to what we believe, but also it's about how does the external environment allow for practices to change. And so basically the core message is you have to work on quite a lot of issues to be able to scale up, for example, alternative food networks. And so this picture summarizes that scaling affects different practice configurations. And so if you work towards your goal and your vision, you have a continuous performance of scaling, but you also have feedback mechanisms based on your own learning processes within the niche, but also the regime context. So this is also a kind of an iterative cyclical process. If you want to scale up, you can also not just follow a plan which you predetermine as a blueprint, you have to reinterpret how you're doing the whole time. So this is kind of an adaptive innovation management. So scaling, and especially when you talk about scaling up alternative food networks, it has different dimensions. And I think that if you talk about alternative food networks, it's really about a cluster of practices. It's not just about changing one practice, it's about changing the way you produce, the way you market, the way you organize yourself, the way you interact with consumers. So this is quite complex, and you can scale them on different, how could you call it? On different determinants or in different parameters. You can have more numeric scaling, which is more related to the scaling out, more numbers, more people involved, more consumers, more farmers involved. It's also about spatial scaling. Do you want to spread out over a large geographical region, or you want to stay very localized, which is of course very relevant in terms of alternative food networks, which also have these roots in the local. It's also about, and this is very much related to ICT, kinematic scaling, does it become faster, more dynamic, more mobile, and also about physical scaling. Are you going to crank up the volumes, or do you want to remain small? Actually, I would say that especially in alternative food networks, these are key dilemmas maybe. And of course, if you do this on a single dimension, this might be much more easier than when you scale up a whole cluster of practices, a whole industry. If you consider alternative food networks as kind of a localized industry of the production of food, because it involves often primary production, but also processing, trade, etc. So, if you look at this from this niche regime perspective, the idea is also that when you go to scaling, it becomes a much more integrated effort. Also because of the learnings of earlier niche developments. So, for example, you have cradle. So some people who say we want to do things differently, they start experimenting, and maybe they start working on one dimension, maybe producing differently, but they maintain similar configurations, for example, to market. But then it could be that they become dissatisfied with that, and then they also start developing different ways of marketing. And then maybe they also start developing their own labels, their own certification. So it's also about that these niches, they mature, and it really goes from a single dimension to really multiple dimension work. And I think really where we are now is really that we are already in what has been called here a tertiary or even farther niche, in which we are really looking at, okay, how to link these different elements together to really make this niche turn into maybe a mainstream practice. So here there's also a difference, and this is also a choice for these niches of alternative food networks. What do they want to do? Here there's a term called eclectic scaling, and there basically it's about working on the regime and changing certain parts of the regime, but still maintaining this thing kind of as a niche which worked under current regime conditions. It really stays an alternative, but it really doesn't grow further. It also remains maybe a niche market. It is a choice for niches. And so this is more kind of this eclectic scaling, really rooting, establishing the niche, but remaining relatively small. What you can also have, and this really relates more to kind of scaling up these whole sectors, what they call system scaling, and there it's really about changing the whole systems and becoming mainstream. And if you don't succeed in that, well, then you are forced to continue as kind of a subculture. And so this is essentially about choices these niches make about where do they want to go. Do they want to become the new regime? So how to do this scaling? And here the concept comes in of what people have been calling anchorage of innovations. We have been seeing that there are all kinds of different wares involved, different elements of practices, technology, infrastructure, motivations, etc. And the idea is that with anchoring, you start getting a hold on the regime and fixing your practices, changing the regime to create a better environment for your practice. That has been called anchorage. And this guy, Elsen, he has distinguished different types of anchorage. So one thing is what you could call technological anchorage. So this is about fine-tuning. This is about having efficient practices. This is about having good distribution networks, having the technology there. If you, for example, need money for investment, that you have a crowdsourcing platform, that you have your client platform. If you want to have direct sales, those kinds of stuff. That is kind of technological anchoring. Institutional anchorage, it's about changing the rules of the game. It's about having certification. For example, hygiene laws, acknowledging your very nice fancy cheese you make on the farm in a very traditional way. But it's also about creating awareness amongst consumers that local food might be better than food coming from Chile, grapes coming from Chile instead from your own region, as long as your region allows for that, for example. And to also do this technological anchorage and institutional anchorage, you need to do network anchorage. You need to create new social arrangements, make new business model. So you really need to negotiate with people and change the way people are doing things. So this is really working on cognitive, allocative, and normative institutions. Cognitive is really about the mental models. Allocative is about all the market rules, the economic rules, and normative is about standards, hygiene rules, laws, etc. And so you really have to work on different wares at different scales, at the local level, the regional level, value chain level. It really involves working with a lot of people. And I think the people who are in these networks, they know that. And you know, you need to get out of the farm, you need to go and talk with that environment and change that environment. So how to do scaling? Some important roles and processes for anchoring. One has been called institutional entrepreneurship, changing the rules of the game. These are champions of change who do advocacy, they change the framings, they create the new networks, they change the system. They are really agents of change, they have lots of energy, they never give up. I think they are the people who more or less let themselves be exploited, figuratively speaking, self-exploitation by themselves, I need to say, because they really believe in that this is a good thing. It's their internal motivation who drives them. It's also about influencing discursive space. The discursive space is the way people talk about food, the way people talk about eating. It's about also shifting conversation, what is good, what is not good. For example, if you think about the example of smoking, which was very normal 20 years ago. My mom, she smoked like a chimney in the car everywhere, you know. I've been exposed to huge quantities of smoke, but the way people talk about smoking has radically changed, and now even in some lower socioeconomic classes where people still smoke a lot, it's for example not done to smoke close to children, and they say no, you should go to the balcony, because people have changed the way they talk about it, how they frame smoking, from being a successful person to be like a young person. When I see people smoking in the street, I get kind of these nasty feelings. I cannot help myself. And so this has also been done through shifting conversations, also helped by mass media campaigns, by changing the rules gradually. And the idea would be also to do that with the current food regime. You already see lots of stuff, work, for example, of animal welfare organizations, saying, you consumer, you are supporting a bad system. And for example, in the Netherlands, we had a campaign with 2 chicken wings or chicken legs who were falling over the whole time. They were walking and they were blaming and shaming one of the major chains for having what they call the explosive chicken, the chicken which grows so fast that they cannot stand on their legs anymore. It's all about influences, discursive space, shifting conversation, the framings of people. And of course, you need to stimulate learning in niches. You need to create new practices, building critical mass. It's about niche learning within niches, also connecting niches, also connecting different streams of alternative food networks maybe, that they can learn from each other, because often they're also competitors, sometimes in terms of paradigms, for example. And then I took this from the introduction. It's about active clustering, food models, public procurement. It's really working on those arrangements and fostering them. And often for that you also need people who are kind of catalysts of that. I work a lot on a concept which relates to brokering in innovation processes, brokering relationships. And for example, what you saw in our organic sector is that you had a brokering organization for connecting the research better to the actual organic movement, and making a connection between farmers and the other chain partners to set the research agenda. Connected to that, they had a task force market development who worked on creating spaces in the supermarkets. Of course, you can discuss whether it's desirable or not, but this is also about brokering new relationships. Of course, these intentional scaling processes, if you really want to foster it, it always takes place within a broader scheme of things, within a broader environment. So here also this idea of landscape developments comes in. Always things take place at the regime level, in the landscape level, which you need to monitor. And this is basically about you need to be aware what's happening to adapt your plan to that. And so scaling should also not be seen as something which you can just plan. It's also something reflexive. That's the main message. Well, I think we all have a reflection of the role of ICTs from our very limited expertise of some of us. If you look at this, what could be the possible role? Well, it's about enhancing niche interaction, a virtual community of practice, for example. It's also about organizational efficiency for value chain organization. It could also be crowdfunding, that kind of stuff. It's about creating and influencing the discursive space, for example, through social media. I think that's being done quite a lot. It can also go terribly wrong, of course. And to do advocacy, enhance market formation, maturation, also that consumers become aware and also start to act in the supermarket on their ideas which they have as a citizen. It's this duality also, the citizen who wants good food and says, yes, no, alternative food network's great, but in the supermarket it's the cheapest stuff he or she buys. And so social media, for example, can work on that. And we will hear much more about this in other presentations, of course. Okay, thanks for your attention. I hope it wasn't too theoretical, but at least it delivers some foundations which might be useful for the project. Thank you.